Good evening, everyone. If I haven't met you yet, I'm David Beckman. I'm the director of the Christian Studies Center, Chattanooga, and I want to welcome you tonight to the first of 3 lectures that we're holding this semester here at UTC on the Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis. And we're very fortunate tonight to have as our first lecturer Dr. Kody Cooper. Dr. Cooper received his PhD in government from the University of Texas in 2014 and joined the faculty of UTC as an assistant professor of political science in 2016. Prior to coming to UTC, Professor Cooper was a postdoctoral research fellow at Princeton University and the University of Missouri, or as they say up there, Missouri. He has also spent a year as a visiting scholar at Wolfson College, Cambridge University in England, which is okay. I would have preferred Oxford, but Cambridge is a pretty place. And he's the author of a book about Thomas Hobbes and natural law theory. And he's got a new book coming out this summer on natural law and the American founding, which ought to be very interesting. Knowing Dr. Cooper as I do, he was one of the first people I approached about speaking for us tonight. And his reply was a firm positive, saying the abolition of man was right up his alley, which I knew it was, so it was good. Now, the Abolition of Man was written by C.S. Lewis and published during World War II in the 1940s. In a letter that he wrote a decade later in 1955, Lewis said of the book that it, quote, has been almost totally ignored by the public, unquote, and he was not far off the mark. It wasn't doing very well. Today, however, Abolition is considered one of his most important and most admired pieces of writing. As commentary, and if you will, prophecy of Western culture, it easily ranks with such 20th century classics as 1984 and Brave New World. Oxford University professor John Lucas describes the book as a, quote, powerful argument, reminiscent of Plato, whom he likes to quote, Pascal and Dostoevsky, and it is worth elaboration afresh in each generation, unquote. So we now tonight anticipate such elaboration at the hand of Dr. Cooper. So let us now welcome him as our first lecturer for our series. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for that introduction, and thank you all for coming out here tonight, trekking through this cold January evening. As I was coming here, I was reflecting on one legendary conversation that took place between Lewis and a couple of friends, J.R. Tolkien and Arthur C. Clarke. Tolkien, of course, being the great author of The Lord of the Rings, Clarke being the great science fiction writer, author of 2001: A Space Odyssey. They had arrived at an English pub on a cold night like this, and they began talking, what would be the best way to travel under such conditions? And Tolkien replied in Hobbiton fashion, well, of course, walking, right? Because, you can build character and virtue, and you can reflect. And Clarke, in more science fiction fashion, said, oh no, in the motor car, or maybe in the rocket train or something that'll get you there fast, conveniently, and in comfort. And Lewis is said to have leaned back and said, well, I'd prefer to travel to the pub by wardrobe. And they turned to him and said, well, really, Jack, how is that possible? And he replied, Narnia business. Okay, that didn't really happen. That's my only C.S. Lewis joke. I'm here all night. But I do have an appreciation for Lewis that has probably been spanned about 25 years now. My first encounter with Lewis was in junior high and high school, reading books like Mere Christianity and the Chronicles of Narnia. And slowly over time, I read through most of his works, and I'd say I still have some things I haven't read of his, but I consider him to be an intellectual influence on me in many ways. And so it's been a pleasure being here at UTC, being the chair of the C.S. Lewis Lecture Committee, helping in some small way to carry forward the tradition that he represented and his work and influence. And it's a pleasure for me to have a chance to talk to you a little bit about his work and the abolition of man and reflect on it. And as Reverend Beckman noted, Lewis's Abolition of Man is one of the great works of philosophy of the 20th century. It's been widely acknowledged and praised for its lucidity, even its prophetic insight into the future, even by some of those who are skeptical of some of its central claims. It has been acknowledged as influential on the thought of major influencers, leaders of culture and politics, everywhere from the President's Council on Bioethics to Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI. How did this book come to be? Well, just a little bit here. The Abolition of Man began as a series of lectures in 1943 at King's College, Newcastle, which is now Newcastle University in England. They were published a bit later. So the historical background of World War II is certainly there, and never far from Lewis's mind. Indeed, you see in the first chapter already the theme of sacrifice, whether it's sweet and proper, dulce et decorum, for one to die for one's country. It's a question of whether that's a noble sentiment or not. But let us not get ahead of ourselves, maybe begin at the beginning. So I'm going to be lecturing on chapter 1 of Abolition of Man tonight. And it's titled Men Without Chests, which you might think is a sort of curious title. And we'll circle back to what I think he's getting at. But the first thing that actually jumps out to you is the epigraph, which reads, So he sent the word to slay and slew the little childer. So he sent the word to slay and slew the little childer. Lewis says this comes from a traditional carol. Does anyone know which historical event is being referenced here? Herod? Yes, so Herod's massacre of the innocents, it's called in church history. And if the story is unfamiliar to you, I'll just briefly recount it as it's narrated in the New Testament in Matthew chapter 2. The wise men of the east come to Herod's court seeking out the Messiah. And it was thus that King Herod, who's the king of the Jews at that time in Israel, became aware that a baby king had apparently been born. So he asked the men to seek him out and then come back and report to him so he could go pay homage. But an angel warns the wise men not to return because apparently Herod wasn't being totally honest about his intentions. And an angel instructed Joseph to flee to Egypt with Mary and the child Jesus. Herod was furious when he found out that he'd been outsmarted by the wise men. And so his solution was to order the slaughter of every boy in Bethlehem and the surrounding area. Now, why open up a book like this? Is this not a horrifying thing to call to mind? A tyrant king who orders the execution of hundreds of little children? Indeed, is there anything more horrifying that you could think of? The reader seems to already feel some sense of foreboding about what is to come. And we start to get a sense of why Lewis begins it this way with the very first sentence. I doubt we are sufficiently attentive to the importance of elementary school books. The suggestion seems to be something very wrong is taking place in schools. Something evil is happening to school children. And then he introduces us to one textbook in particular, which he calls the Green Book. And he gives the authors pseudonyms to protect their anonymity, Gaius and Titius, or Titius, if you prefer. The Green Book is a pseudonym for a real book called The Control of Language, A Critical Approach to Reading and Writing. And its authors were two Oxford-educated Australian professors, Alec King and Martin Ketley. And the book they wrote was widely used as a high school and even university textbook in English grammar. But who they were and the actual name of the book doesn't really matter for Lewis's purposes. First, because Lewis was a gentleman scholar and it was, he wasn't really interested in scoring sort of petty points, dealing out literary jabs. But more importantly, the Green Book is a kind of book, or it represents a kind or type of book that is all too common in modern education, that advocates for subjectivism and which provides a useful foil for Lewis's own defense of natural law philosophy, what Lewis will call the Tao. In other words, Abolition of Man gives an account and a defense of an objective or transcendent standard of the true, the good, and the beautiful. Lewis begins to elucidate the Tao by way of contrast with the central claims of the Green Book. And he focuses it on one story initially from the Green Book about Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who is sort of a romantic writer, poet, author. And this was an anecdote reported about him visiting a particular waterfall in Scotland. And Coleridge was sort of sitting there thinking about how great waterfalls were and trying to think of the proper way to describe it. And a tourist comes and says, "That's sublime." And Coleridge agrees. Says, "Yes, that's right, it's sublime." According to Gaius and Titius, in reality, Coleridge was giving a report not about the waterfall as an external reality, rather, he was reporting his own feelings. To say that the waterfall is sublime is really to say, I have sublime feelings about the waterfall. Now, you might say, well, okay, what's the point here? Maybe I could give you an alternative illustration of what Gaius and Titius are doing. Imagine that I'm married and I have several small children. Imagine that after this lecture, being a husband to a pregnant wife and father to several children, I say, yeah, it's kind of a lot of work. I'm tired. I need to rest. I don't really sleep very much. Maybe I'll just abandon them, go start a new life somewhere else. And imagine learning of this, my wife or maybe ex-wife says to me, "You are contemptible." According to Gaius and Titius, well, that just means my wife has contemptible feelings. So I would be justified in replying to her, well, your feelings are contemptible. That's all you mean. But in actuality, if I said that on Gaius and Titius' principles, I'm actually reporting only something about my feelings about her feelings. So the sentence, "Your feelings are contemptible," means my feelings are contemptible. Are you following? If you are starting to find this somewhat absurd, then Lewis will have achieved his object. Because that's not what we mean when we try to communicate such things. This is one example of Lewis deploying an argumentum ad absurdum, drawing out his interlocutor's position to a logically absurd conclusion. What is the effect of all of this on the pupil who is learning about Coleridge and waterfalls? Well, Lewis suggests that it's a subtle effect. The mind of the young person is being formed to believe that his beliefs about what is beautiful or sublime are merely subjective. Right? They are not emotions or sentiments that align more or less with an objective reality that the person is beholding. Right? It has no essential relation to some object outside of itself that merits or demerits that feeling. So the Green Book, Lewis says, is operating the mode of debunking. Right? It takes a critical eye toward emotions. In this example, it's the emotion of awe, or the emotional state of being awe-stricken. The debunker, right, is supposing and inculcating an aesthetic subjectivism or emotivism, which is to say, all statements about beauty are reducible without leftover to subjective feelings or the emotions of the speaker. Now, Lewis pivots to consider another sentiment that the Green Book seeks to debunk, namely the feelings of piety associated with patriotism. So there's an advertisement that the Green Book picks up and critiques, which to contemporary English folks promised potential customers a cruise in which English passengers would go on the same adventures and visit the same places as the great English explorer Sir Francis Drake. Right? So the prospect of traveling in the wake of Sir Francis Drake might stir or stoke in someone a patriotic desire for adventure, right, in that tradition. And the Green Book seeks to debunk the advertisement by suggesting there's no real object corresponding to such desires. Lewis's point isn't really not so concerned about this sort of frivolous advertisement. What he's concerned about is this critical method that debunks the emotions appealed to in the advertisement could be extended to all literature, to all historical materials, to all the great writings that are the treasure or the inheritance of one's country, which might arouse in the reader some love of one's country, which might spark in the reader some desire to take risks, to go on adventures, to perform great deeds out of patriotism. And now Lewis gives us one more example of the debunking spirit from another book, from another author that he calls Orbilius. And Orbilius debunks a passage about English settlement in Australia in which horses are deemed willing servants. Orbilius says, that's not literally true, right? A horse cannot will or be a servant. They're mere material beasts. And Lewis says, okay, yeah, that is a bit of bad writing about horses, but there's also good writing about horses, even if it's non-literal. Recall Achilles' horses weeping at the death of Patroclus in the Odyssey, right? Or St. Francis referring to beasts as brothers, right? Now, presumably, it's not literally true that, tears and sobs poured out of the horse, or that, right, the ass or the horse was literally Francis's brother. And yet, Orbilius's principles and method implicitly debunks literature like this that would hearken a warm love or sentiment towards animals, that humanizes them, anthropomorphizes them in a way. And so, says Lewis about the pupil who reads this stuff about animals or patriotism or waterfalls, he thinks this has really bad effects. Quote, some pleasure in their ponies or dogs the pupil will have lost. Some incentive to cruelty or neglect they will have received. By debunking these common sentiments or ordinary feelings about one's country or animals or cataracts in nature, the authors and teachers of green books are effectively cutting pieces out of pupils' souls. And now we start to understand a bit more why Lewis began with the epigraph that he did. The idea seems to be that modern education is engaged in the spiritual slaughter of children, or at least the spiritual maiming of them. And at this point, Lewis now steps back for a moment to reflect. Do the authors of the Green Book really understand what they're up to? Right? Well, he doesn't attribute to them the worst possible motives. He says, well, maybe they're reacting to what he calls sentimentalism, the kind of idea that people are driven by emotion and therefore super subject to emotional propaganda. So maybe the debunking is an attempt to fortify them, to give them good, stiff English upper lips, right? Lewis disagrees, right? He thinks that most of his students suffer more from cold vulgarity rather than an excess of sentiment. And he doesn't think this will work for, quote, famished nature will be avenged, and a hard heart is no infallible protection against a soft head. Okay, but there's a deeper reason that Gaius and Titius adopt this procedure, Lewis suggests. It is that they have rejected wholesale their inheritance, the natural law philosophical tradition, the metaphysical realism of classical Western philosophy, civilization, indeed, even non-Western, Eastern philosophy and civilization. And now Lewis takes a few pages to start to illuminate this tradition and its approach to education. In the classical, metaphysically realist view, there is an objective world outside of the mind, to which the mind relates either well or poorly. This objective reality presents to us objects that, of their very nature, merit some emotional state, right? Such as awe in the case of natural beauties, or in the case of human behaviors, moral approval or disapproval. This summer, I took my family to Yellowstone National Park. You ever had a chance to go to Yellowstone out there? Oh, hey, a few of you. And you may, and those of you who have been, those of you who haven't been, you may know that there's the upper and lower falls, one of the big attractions. And if you ever have a chance to go, you might start to feel a little stirring of an emotion when you look at it. And you might wonder whether it's similar or even identical in kind to the one that Coleridge felt. You might get the feeling of awe and humility, because in comparison to it, you are small. On the classical natural law view, these feelings are correlative to the nature of the thing being observed, a truly awesome or sublime occurrence in nature, to which the proper response is awe and humility. Similarly, if you stop and reflect on, I don't know, say, the slaughter of innocent children by a tyrant king, you might feel horror, sadness, anger, indignation at the injustice. Now, if you do, according to the classical natural lawyer, your feelings are correlative to your implicit or explicit recognition of an objective moral value, that innocent human life is not to be killed, or that innocent human life is valuable, and the objective moral rule that it ought not to be killed. And this is not only a Judeo-Christian belief. Lewis is quick to clarify. Lewis shows how the idea of a given order in nature, prior to our thinking about it, and to which our judgments and emotions either do or do not conform, is apparent in the great ancient pagan philosophies of the West and the East, right? Greek, Plato and Aristotle, Roman, Stoic, Eastern, Hindu, Chinese. Lewis uses a term of art to refer to this tradition of philosophy broadly considered and its approach to education as the Tao. For adherents to the Tao, early childhood education is about properly forming the sentiments according to an objective order of truth, beauty, and goodness, which we do not create, but which we discover and pass on to our children. So partisans of the Green Book, Lewis suggests, are taken in by the claims of modern materialist science, right? The Green Bookers effectively seek to separate the world of facts from the world of values. What does he mean by this? Well, I was trying to think of a good example, and maybe this isn't a very good one, but science can tell me that, say, I need to heat up this pot of oil to 300 degrees to make it boil, right? Because it's empirically observable. You can replicate it, right? You can discover it for yourself through many repetitions. But it can't tell me whether it's valuable or disvaluable to stick my hand in there, right? It can tell me that it will burn human skin, but science doesn't tell me whether it's good or bad to have burnt skin. Science, or nature so conceived, can tell you nothing about values. On this view, no emotion or desire is more objectively reasonable than another. Again, emotions and desires are in themselves experiences that differ from person to person. And to say that one desire is more reasonable than another would be to indicate some objective standard grasped by reason. So the person who desires to boil his hand to make a hand sandwich is no less or more reasonable than someone who does not so desire, apparently. Now, on a classical natural law view, a desire to self-cook and self-cannibalize would be disordered because destructive of one's bodily health and integrity, contrary to the duties regarding one's life and health. But such a move is unavailable to Gaius and Titius, but presumably they wouldn't want a society of auto-cannibalism. Now, perhaps most or all of you will feel disapproval of auto-cannibalism. I don't know, but maybe it's a safe assumption. Maybe here's a harder one. Would you feel approval at the idea that it is good to sacrifice something up to and even including one's life for one's country. The ancient Roman father, Lewis discusses, passed down this sentiment to his son, and perhaps even exemplified it on the battlefield. And Lewis says this is kind of a passing down of manhood from father to son. But the new educators who might want similar behaviors for the good of society have to try to get the emotions in the pupil in a different way. The new educators have debunked common sense emotions. Now they have to labor to produce it through propaganda, Lewis says. But the Green Book decries propaganda. So, okay, so maybe get a little confusing, and Lewis commends it for that. But Lewis says that their alternative debunking method has disastrous results. And here is where he gives us his picture, and indeed a picture that he borrows from someone prior to him, of classical philosophical anthropology. The distinction, the tripartite distinction between intellect or reason in the head, spirit or spiritedness in the chest, and bodily appetites, such as appetites of the table or the belly. And this is borrowed from Plato, right, which is perhaps the most influential non-Christian thinker on Lewis's line. Maybe you can debate that, but certainly is very influential. In Plato's dialogues, you see this, particularly in dialogues like the Republic. Socrates distinguishes between three parts of the soul. And he offered it as a philosophical psychology that would apply to all human beings across time and culture. Right? So this is not a culturally relativist, as this applies in 4th century DC Greece or something only. No. At least as the way Socrates and Plato would understand it, anyone who shares in the nature of being human, this would apply to. And so we now circle back to the title of the chapter, Men Without Chests. How can we get at this idea of chest, what Plato would call thumos? To illustrate the idea, Plato tells the story of one Leontius, and this is in, I think, Book 4 of the Republic. And so Plato is trying, or Socrates is talking with his interlocutors in there, and he's trying to lay out how you can yourself affirm and understand how there's these different principles or these different parts of you, the mind, the spiritedness, and sort of animal desire. So what does he mean by that? Well, Leontius was this guy that apparently one day was walking between Athens and the Piraeus. So this is during the Peloponnesian War, and so between Athens and the Piraeus is several miles. They had this sort of defensive walls that connected the two. So the Piraeus is down by the water. It's like a harbor city, and then Athens over here, and you've got these walls that connect the two cities, so people can go back and forth safely. Leontius is walking along one day, and all of a sudden he sees out of the corner of his eye a bunch of corpses piled up, and he desires to look, but right, in sort of Greek culture and maybe more generally, there's something shameful about ogling the dead body out of mere curiosity. And so he feels another pull inside of him. Now, don't do that. That would be shameful. And so with regard to the same object, he feels a pull within himself, one direction, one way, one another way. And finally, Leontius gives in and looks at the corpses and says, "Feast eyes, you wretches," and feels great shame afterwards of what he had done. So what's Plato's point? Well, thumos, or spiritedness, the chest, is this distinct principle in a person that is the seat of a specific set of emotions like shame, anger, sense of honor, and therefore virtues like magnanimity and proper indignation and injustice. Whereas there's another set of desires that could be at war with that. There's various other examples here. I don't know if that's clear. But another example that sometimes I tell my students about is a number of years ago, I think this may have been maybe over 10 years ago, I can't remember, but I remember a report in the press about Kate Middleton, the Duchess of Cambridge, who was newly married to Prince William. And apparently a paparazzi photographer snuck somewhere where he wasn't supposed to be and had like a super zoom lens and took a picture of Kate Middleton when she was sunbathing partially nude. And then took the photo and tried to sell it to British tabloids or newspapers. And my recollection is they universally said no, turned away. There'd be something dishonorable with that. There'd be something shameful with the eyes may want to feast, but no, that would be something wrong with doing that. Right? This is what Plato's trying to get at, how you can have an experience within your soul of resisting desires in light of other desires. This is spiritedness. Right? The chest, the seat of emotions like anger and shame, the virtue of magnanimity. Greatness of soul, which is to say a proper sense of honor, of self-respect, and the attendant virtues that give one a proper sense of shame and response to injustice, etc. Plato's idea is that the chest is therefore naturally an ally of the head. It would be unreasonable to feast with one's eyes on something that is not proper to feast one's eyes upon. And the chest can ally with the head in opposing those desires, those lower desires of animal man. And indeed, the chest can be trained, tamed to assist the governance of reason, of desire. Lewis's worry is that the debunkers, by systematically excising from the human soul sentiments of the chest, they are thereby effectively making men without chests, or as one recent restatement of the idea goes, humans without hearts. The natural effect of this will be to create two new categories of human beings, at least, sort of cerebral men, the intellectual or pseudo-intellectual fatheads who are the conditioners of a new society, and visceral man, the trousered ape, who is driven principally by his base desires and whatever other desires the conditioners see as useful to implant in him. It also, I think, gives rise to what later philosophers like Robert Bellah, Charles Taylor, and others have called a culture of expressive individualism. On this view, the true or authentic self is identified with subjective emotional states. And those emotions need to be allowed to unfold and indeed receive social support and affirmation, even and especially when those feelings are thought to be in disaccord with objective reality, if human dignity is to be achieved. So the task of education becomes less about shaping the person in accordance with an ideal, but a kind of triumph of the therapeutic, which is an education tailored to the pupil's inner sense of psychological well-being. So Lewis has set the table for what he's going to talk about in the next couple of chapters. He's going to lay out in more detail the claims of the Tao and where he sees things going. So I'm going to stop there because I don't want to ruin the lectures to come. But I invite your questions or comments.